Hey everybody, it's Professor Keegan here with a video lecture on the material because class was canceled. I am so sad and angry at Zoom for basically like making snow days extinct. But here we are. Technology is not always good. I wanted to start out just pushing some reminders to you about how we're dealing with physical meetings being canceled. I am currently in our Blackboard site, and I wanted to show you what I've done in here so that you know where to go to do things. First of all, under discussions, I've created a forum for questions about your term exploration essay. Remember, this is due between Sunday and Tuesday end of day, right? So there's a pretty broad window for submitting it. We will be meeting Tuesday physically before the cutoff, but a lot of you probably want to submit this before then, before the week begins. So you can go in here and create a thread to ask a question, and I will be checking this throughout the weekend to see if anything populates into here. I think this is easier than fielding a million emails. So yeah, create thread, and then I was careful to also ask you to please be really specific about what you're asking about, and also if you could provide me with clips from the paper or a draft file if you're asking a more sort of overarching question about structure. That will just help me better understand the context in which your question is happening. Okay, so that is under discussions. And then under assignments and instructions and guides, I have created an assignment window for your journal for today. This is due by the end of day today, so please don't forget about it. Right, I'm asking you to simply just like every class period, give me some actual critical responses, your thoughts in response to the material we read, which is the Litauer article. Again, keep in mind what I'm looking for here. I'm looking for you to demonstrate that you are starting to have a working understanding of the structures of queer history. Where have we been? How did the 1940s and 50s change things? How didn't they change things? What were some of the most important things that happened? And do we see echoes of that history today? In some ways, we're back in the 50s right now. So I would hope that you would be seeing some connections. Okay, so this under assignments and instructions and guides is where you're going to submit today's journal by the end of the day. And then remember, your term exploration essay could be turned in as early as Sunday night. That's here for you now too. Okay, so you can submit that under the same tab. Okay, all right, let us go to slides. I'm going to have to re-screen share. Okay, so we are now well into the 20th century. We are still, you'll notice, in the before identity unit. This has been a very long unit. It has stretched all the way from basically the moment of European colonization, which we would roughly date to around 1600 on the North American continent, to basically 1960. That's, think about it, almost 4 centuries of history we're looking at before there was an organized sense of shared political identity in the queer community. We're now in the very kind of short decade before gay liberation. A lot of the things that happened between 1945 and 1965 caused gay liberation. So I'd like you to be thinking about that as we move forward into next week. These are women doing factory work during World War II. You might be familiar with Rosie the Riveter as a sort of popular image from the time. A lot of what made World War II special in queer history was how it opened a lot of people up to being able to live outside of traditional gender norms because of the way that the war reorganized gender. Women were asked to do a lot of what we would consider typically male or masculine tasks, labor, in ways that they hadn't necessarily before because so many men were drafted into World War II. And I'll talk a bit about that, but that's the context for this photo. Okay, so a broad overview, World War II effects on gender and sexuality. We're talking 1939 to roughly 1945, 48. First of all, we had the mobilization of basically all of US society around the war effort. So this was many, many men going off to fight, leaving their wives behind, leaving their families behind, and lots of women stepping into roles men had left behind at home, like particularly workplace roles, but also breadwinner roles, being the heads of households, right? Things that especially white women hadn't been doing. So this caused sort of society to split into single gender fronts, right? The war front and the home front. The war front was a sort of masculine space. The home front was really kind of dominated by women. Um, and so there was a lot of that provided a lot of context for a lot of people to start discovering or experimenting with their sexuality. And it was so important for the war that this sort of gender split be happening, that queerness just kind of got overlooked. People were like, well, that's just an effect of what we're doing, and we'll have to tolerate it because the war is more important, right? So oddly, wartime in this context turned out to be a fairly tolerant time for the expression of queerness and transness, because there was a larger set of concerns that people were worried about, which was, winning the war. I just covered this, but right, the war made society into single gender environments, what we call homosocial spaces. Right, so many people became aware of queer attraction in new ways because of that. Um, and we had a lot of people, again, moving into cities to work in factories where men had left those jobs. So a lot of agrarian folks from rural spaces are coming in a big wave into the cities. And there's all this new interest in going out to the bars, going to see a show, going to very early film, right? This is the period of this sort of pre-Hays Code Hollywood, also. So there were a lot of attractions that cities had that started sort of catering to this idea of there are certain types of people who might like queer entertainment. Right. We also talked about how women's increased public role in what were thought of as traditionally male areas of the economy, particularly um, altered notions of gender. Like it was demonstrated that women could do a lot of the things men traditionally were doing, and a lot of women were working together in more intimate conditions with other women than they had in the past. This was also true in the military because we had entire all-female nurses units like the Waves and Wax in World War II, which were also spaces where queerness could really develop and thrive. So all of this is really impacting how gender is traditionally understood. There's also attendant on that the emergence of these sort of early queer public spaces. Now, we've talked about the importance of neighborhoods, of spaces of concentrated queer activity like Harlem and Greenwich Village. But within these spaces, there start to be specific spaces reserved for queer entertainments, especially because of all of the service personnel who are going on leave in port cities across the United States. A lot of gay soldiers are coming home from serving and they want to blow off steam. They want to go see a show. They want to go dancing, right? They want to go out and drink. And so a lot of port cities, if you think about where a lot of the queer nightlife is located in the US, even today, um, San Francisco and New York City are really important spaces, partially because of how this industry grew up during World War II. A lot of gay bars began in this era. Again, these would be surreptitious because it was illegal, but they're still there, right? But that also includes Boston, New Orleans, right? Places like that where lots of ships would be coming in. So what we have is, for sort of the first time nationwide in many urban centers, a sort of public congregation of queer and trans people coming together in public space in ways that were kind of overlooked by the cops or sort of permitted because these were soldiers serving in the war, right? It's these exact spaces that after the war are going to get cracked down on really hard, and that is going to spark gay liberation. right? So queer and trans soldiers on leave are seeking spaces in which to meet and socialize, to get R&R, and we get a new public culture, much more kind of open and kind of accessible to people. It's something people know about, begins to emerge around the idea of queer sexuality and queer specific entertainments for certain types of people who have that kind of sexual or gendered interest. This includes, again, bars, dancing, sexual services like brothels, nightclubs, and also places to buy queer literature like sort of gay dime novels and things like that. Um, uh, early pornography. Right. So here's an example from Mona's Club 440, which is the earliest lesbian bar in San Francisco, started circa 1942 during the war. And this is an ad for a show by Gladys Bentley, who was a Black performer who performed in male drag, and was very much admired by many queer female audiences across the country. So she did a lot of touring at this time. A lot of queer celebrities got their start in this period where there was an audience and a sort of socially tolerant climate for this kind of entertainment. So you can see how this would be advertised to, implicitly queer audiences, right? America's greatest piano artist, Gladys Bentley, brown bomber of sophisticated songs. Um, the same type of gay entertainment that has made the 440 Club famous. So the word gay here is used as a kind of insider-outsider word, right? If you are queer, you read it one way, and if you're not, you might read it as just, oh, it's a fun entertainment, right? Here is an example of a painting from Paul Cadmus during sort of the early period of World War II, called Fleet's Inn. Cadmus was a queer artist who painted many scenes of social life during the 30s and 40s. And if you look carefully, these soldiers are actually hanging out with some what appear to be transgender women, possibly sex workers down on the docks, having a good time. This is one example of how public queer sexuality started to be recognized in American art. And then there's just the sort of single gender environments that were part and parcel of the war that provided a context in which many people realized their queer sexualities. This is an ad for Canon towels, which by our standards seems pretty gay. I mean, all these dudes are together naked, snapping each other with towels, right? And then miles away on the home front, there is one woman with a towel, right? Like, you can see the gender division that the ad is addressing, and also the sort of potential queer attraction of being in the army with a bunch of men during this time period. A lot of people wouldn't have thought of this ad as obviously gay then, but today it's kind of unmistakably, implicitly queer to our modern eye. An example of single gender environments, again, men away in the war, it provided space for them to do all kinds of gendered expression. We see here what looks like a company of maybe airmen, some of whom are in drag, right, just for fun. The way in which the army opened up opportunities for, ironically, what we would consider cross-dressing or transgender expression for some people. And then on the other side, we have women posing inside the Green Door in North Hollywood, right? This is a lesbian bar in the 50s where a lot of women are going out to meet each other. We see a sort of culture of sort of butch gender expression growing up in the lesbian community at this time. And these women are, it's one of the few instances of women posing intentionally for photographs during a time where being in a space like this could get you arrested. So again, men and women are very separated at this time. So all of that is a setup for what happens when the war ends, right? Because all the men come back, right? And after World War II, there's a real focus on snapping everything back to how it was before the war. There's a really, really conservative turn the country takes. And traditional gender norms really get reasserted by the federal government. Right. And there was a huge amount of pressure on people who had come out or come to a realization of their queerness or transness during the war to get forced back into the closet. Like that was okay during the war because we were like having to like really do a thing together and we've tolerated it, but now that's over and we have to go back to being, you know, the traditional America that we were before. And also America has this new superpower status after World War II that we're really trying to justify by demonstrating gender normativity. So during this time, you may be aware of the Red Scare, which was this anti-communist paranoia that struck the US where in the 1950s, Senator Joseph McCarthy, but also the House Un-American Activities Commission were investigating communist spies in Hollywood and really ruining the lives of a lot of people with this idea that there were communists secretly hiding in the culture and like sending information to Russia, right? A lot of people were blacklisted, could never work in Hollywood again. They really targeted artists. They tended to target Jewish intellectuals and creators, and they also targeted queer people. A lot of you probably haven't been taught the context of the Lavender Scare, which was basically the gay version of the Red Scare. I have a quick, actually, video about this because a lot of you don't know what happened at this time, and I want to actually show this to you. It's going to take me a minute to switch my screens around. Here we go. So this is just a really quick trailer of a film documentary on the Lavender Scare, and it should illustrate to you kind of how people were being treated.
We have your friend in the next room. She's already told us that you're a guest. You give us the names of others and we'll go easier on you.
Committee will please come to order.
Homosexuals must not be handling top secret material. The pervert is easy prey to the blackmailer.
It started this Lavender Scare. It started this systematic campaign to identify and remove all suspected gay men and lesbians from the Federal Civil Service.
I was called to the FBI office.
They wouldn't allow legal representation.
I was a scared kid.
They wouldn't reveal the evidence.
They said, we have information, you are homosexual. Do you have any comment?
And they would threaten exposure.
I submitted my resignation.
I lost my job at the patent office.
That was the end of it. I was the first person to fight back out of all of those large, huge number of people that were fired in the 50s.
And in 1965, he led a protest outside the White House, which was both an act of conscience, but also an act of extraordinary courage. We are proud of you, Frank, and we are grateful to you for your leadership.
I mean, it's a heartache that you have the rest of your days.
All of this needs to be said. People need to know.
So this is a feature-length documentary that you can check out on your own time if you're interested in this period of history and what you haven't been taught about it. But basically, the federal government, which is the largest employer in the nation, in 1952 began a purge of all queer employees under the excuse that being queer made you vulnerable to communist blackmail. Like, because they could, if a spy found out you were queer, they could threaten to out you and thereby get you to like give them information and stuff like that. So you can see how queerness came to be thought of as unpatriotic, as a sort of secret menace that needed to be detected and eradicated, right, from the country. And so there was a whole swing in focus toward policing queer people, forcibly outing them, getting them out of public life, getting them out of public service. Queer public service is made illegal. Queer immigration is made illegal in 1952, right? And a real use of the police and the FBI, particularly, to enforce these things. Even the development of specific police squads to basically investigate and arrest and harass queer people, called vice squads or morals squads. They were responsible for really regulating sexuality and gender. I have an example of what would happen if you were a kid at this time, like if you were 10, 12 years old in 1955, 60, my mom was 10 years old, you might get someone, a cop, visit your class in school and tell you these kinds of things.
There may be some in this auditorium. There may be some here today that will be homosexual in the future. There are a lot of kids here. There may be some girls that'll turn lesbian. We don't know. But it's serious. Don't kid yourselves about it. They can be anywhere. They can be judges, lawyers. We ought to know we've arrested all of them. So if any one of you have let yourself become involved with an adult homosexual or with another boy, and you're doing this on a regular basis, you better stop quick. Because 1 out of 3 of you will turn queer. And if we catch you involved with a homosexual, your parents are going to know about it first. And you will be caught. Don't think you won't be caught. Because this is one thing you cannot get away with. This is one thing that if you don't get caught by us, you'll be caught by yourself. And the rest of your life will be a living hell.
So that's some of how queerness was being discussed. And again, I'd like you to think about the context of developmental citizenship that we talked about last week, right? There's this fear that exposure to queerness will spread queerness, and people will choose to remain in that homosexual phase of developmental citizenship, and they won't move on to normal adulthood heterosexuality. And so in the 1950s, particularly, the police get involved really heavily in trying to stamp out and expose queerness. So there's a real wave of renewed criminalization of queerness at this time, right? So intense police pressure is starting to be directed against those urban queer public spaces that grew up during the war. Gay bars particularly, we know that where does gay liberation start? It starts from these spaces, gay bars like Stonewall, all-night restaurants like Compton's, where queer people are just trying to have a drink, meet somebody, have a hamburger, a cup of coffee, and the cops are showing up and being like, look, we don't tolerate your presence anymore. It's not, the war's over. This is, you need to disappear or we're going to arrest you, right? And it's that targeted police pressure on these spaces that queer people had come to enjoy that produces this resistance that we see in the 60s, right? So what are some things that are happening? Queer and trans people are targeted with arrests. The bars they hang out are being constantly raided. They're being arrested for cross-dressing. They're being beaten up. They're being sexually assaulted by police. They're being put in jail. Their names are being printed in the paper so that they lose their jobs, right? And a lot of this is being done by special elite tax squads or moral squads that have developed to manage queer life. So in the Littauer reading, she notes that, you know, what happens is that queer people develop all kinds of strategies for hiding in plain sight, of passing within straight culture and only knowing when it was okay to express queerness and when it wasn't. And she calls this strategic discretion, which is a very different idea than the idea of outness, which outness comes after this as a new strategy during gay liberation, a political strategy. But during the 50s, things were so oppressive and scary for a lot of queer people that this idea of being strategically queer only was much more common and really this is why we're still in the before identity moment, because people got married, many queer people were married to opposite gender partners at this time, just to get through life, and then would have like some strategically discrete queer practices they might engage in. But these identities don't look anything like the modern queer and trans identities we have now, because of the period itself making a queer life so hard to live entirely. A really important year is 1952. A lot of things happen in 1952, right, that almost provokes a response from queer people. It takes a while, as you noticed in the video, that little clip of the homophiles that you read about today. It's not until really 65 that we start getting public protests against this stuff. So it takes over a decade for people to organize and develop strategies. But what we see is a new focus on queerness, or just on homosexuality as a sort of sexuality only problem. These aren't people who are gender nonconforming necessarily, so they're not obviously queer. The nation is thinking about gay people as they could be anybody, right? They're not visibly different from straight people, right? And that makes these forces of control, these regulatory forces like the cops, obsessed with identifying secret queers, right? The same way that they're trying to identify communist spies, right? So a lot of things happen in this time to try to flush out queerness from within various institutions. First of all, the Army adds a military screening discharge for homosexuality. A lot of people who served in World War II could not get the benefits of the GI Bill when they came home. This was true for Black soldiers. Couldn't get those really cheap mortgages, couldn't move to the suburbs, couldn't go to college for free, right? Same thing for queer discharges from the military. Homosexuality is added to the DSM as a mental illness in this period, 1952. It's recodified as a psychopathic disorder. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952 bans queer immigrants as psychopathic, and we get that purge in the federal government. For all sort of queer or trans employees lose their jobs, basically. So really concentrated anti-queer moment in US history. The response was the development of homophile organizations, which are the earliest gay and lesbian political groups in the US. It's important to realize that like people politicize because they're angry or because they had something that got taken away, right? So all of the more tolerant conditions of World War II, which supported people coming out and developing relationships and identifications, suddenly get taken away, and that pisses people off, right? So it's pretty rapidly we get a political response, but it's mostly from early on white middle-class people who particularly had lost professional jobs in the purges. And their approach was to form groups where they tried to educate people about homosexuality, to use peaceful means, to be very respectful, and try to claim like, we're just like you. We're respectable US citizens. We just want our rights, right? So it didn't look anything like the stuff at Stonewall, which comes later. They were really focused on earning job and legal protections for themselves, right? Middle-class, white, gender-conforming, gay and lesbian people. The two earliest groups, Daughters of Bilitis, forms in 1955. Notice, like only 3 years after this 1952 really bad year. And the Mattachine Society actually forms even before 1952. These are focused on the West Coast, where a lot of gay people were living, sort of sticking around in the sort of queer nightlife scene that developed during World War II. So these are early what were called homophile organizations. These are some examples you saw in the quick clip of the Lavender Scare trailer, some video. We actually have film stock of these protests from the 60s, right? This top photo is actually that 1965 picket in Philadelphia that the Mattachine Society actually held. Right, 1950s through mid 60s, gay and lesbian homophile groups formed, peacefully picketed, and developed their own literature. So we have The Ladder, which was a sort of magazine, a review magazine put out by Daughters of Bilitis, and then the Mattachine Review, right, starts publishing. Also, you see the date there is, the dates are 56 and 59. So these are magazines you could kind of secretly get your hands on if you were on like an anonymized mailing list. And then trans people, you might be like, well, where are the trans people? Because there's so much energy directed at homosexuality as this kind of invisible threat. But we know from reading Stryker that trans people are organizing as well around wanting access to healthcare, around the cross-dressing rules, right? So they were actually forming their own social networks and their own newsletters and literature. So we have people like Reed Erickson, who's a very wealthy trans man who's going to go on to fund most of the infrastructure for trans healthcare in the US in the 1960s and 70s. And we read about Virginia Prince, next to Reed there, who was a cross-dresser who ended up sort of ending her life more in the role of a trans woman, actually, who is forming one of the earliest social groups for trans people in the country, and also founding Transvestia, which is the oldest trans magazine in US history. So I want you to understand the crackdown causes this bubbling up of like, hey, wait a minute, we're being targeted as a group. What if we organized, right? What if we had an organized response to this shared oppression? Sometimes oppression can teach people that they have something in common and that there's power there. And it's not long before people start to push back. We get this more sort of civil rights model of the homophile organizing, which is very different in some ways from the much more militant public resistance that we get at Compton's and Stonewall and other places where working class queer and trans people are being beat up by cops, right? So I want you to think about different styles of activism that develop from different experiences of this period, okay? So don't forget to put your reading journal on Blackboard under that discussions tab. And I'll look for, oh no, it's under the assignments tab. The discussions tab is for feedback on or questions about your term exploration essay. I'll look forward to what you have to say about the materials, and I will see you next week.